Hello, friends. So I want to do a little video lecture here on the notion of prevenient grace and its relationship to predestination. This will certainly continue to be an idea that we'll explore in the next few weeks. But let's go back and let's notice first of all that both words start with pre. Okay. And the pre that's a God prefix. The prefix is a God prefix. Predestination refers to God's election, God electing certain people, of course, to certainly to glory, and then the question of how actively God is involved in predestining to damnation would depend on the thinker. So either you have, sort of a double predestination, or you could have a single predestination where God elects certain people to be saved and the others are damned, but it's not like God is, going out of the divine way to damn them. That's just the state they're in, right? It's a fine line. But prevenient grace has also got that prefix that is a divine prefix. We may have talked about this before, but prevenient is an interesting word. Pre is before, veni is the Latin word for come. I'm no Latin expert. That's one of my few Latin words. But so prevenient in terms of its etymology is that which comes before. So you put grace in there. It's grace that comes before. Grace is also, of course, always divine grace. This is the divine grace that comes before any human inclination, any human thought, any human desire toward God. Always God's grace precedes. Now, predestination, of course, is God freely electing certain people to be saved. And we need to know that St. Augustine, who, of course, especially in his bouts with Pelagius, became, I think, increasingly hardened in his predestinarian point of view. Even so, he did use the phrase prevenient grace. It goes at least as far back as to St. Augustine. However, for Augustine, the phrase prevenient grace is only applicable to those who are predestined. So if we take Augustine as our great example, shucks, my wife is calling me right now. Rather than try to pause this, because then, it's in my pocket. Sorry about this. Okay. Hey, honey, I'm right in the middle of a video, okay? Can I call you back in a second? Okay. So, for Augustine, in his own lifetime, he tells his story in Confessions, and essentially we could say this, that Augustine comes to the point of conversion out on the patio of the villa that he rented with his roomies in Milan. And everything that he relays up to that point about God, working in his life, drawing Augustine ever so gently along until his point of conversion, we could call that prevenient grace, and we would be correct to do so. So this prevenient grace of God was at work in the life of Augustine precisely because Augustine was one of God's elect. So prevenient grace operates under the umbrella of predestination as the work of the Holy Spirit working irresistibly, even if gradually, finally working irresistibly, this is irresistible grace, to bring salvation, or to bring Augustine into a relationship of salvation to God, or by God through Christ. Now, So it was also with Thomas Aquinas and other thinkers who, Catholic thinkers who taught predestination, but also assumed that in the lives of the elect, this this grace of God is experienced, in very specific ways, both after their conversion, but also leading up to their conversion. But again, this would only be in the lives of the elect. So it was, I think, basically this would have been Luther's assumption. I'm not sure that he uses the phrase prevenient grace much. This is where, by way of anticipation, we'll say that Luther gets drawn into, or probably it's more that Erasmus gets drawn into a debate with Martin Luther. Erasmus, kind of a rascal, but a Dutch Catholic humanist scholar, biblical scholar, theologian of sorts, more of an ethicist probably, and somewhat on the verge of Pelagianism. And Luther certainly thought he was nothing more than a damn Pelagian. And I do mean damned in this case, especially with Luther talking. But Erasmus, of course, knew the history of the debates between Pelagius and Augustine that had occurred a millennium earlier. And I think Erasmus was enough of he was a smart dude. He was a very smart dude. And he argued, say, on the basis of the text that you'll read later in the anthology, well, it's in the Bible, the story of Cain and Abel, where God comes to Cain in a world that is already a fallen world, right? This is the fallen world. Sin has entered the picture. But we read that God comes to Cain and asks questions, like, what's bugging you? Why is your face so long? Do you not know that if you do well, you'll be accepted? But if you do not do well, look out. Sin lurks like a lion at the door. Its desire is to overcome you, but you must master it. God sounds a little like a Pelagian there. Well, the way that Erasmus interpreted this and argued is that here you have a situation where Cain's a sinner. Cain's under the power of original sin, like everybody else, including Abel. And God comes to Cain to try to talk him out of his increasingly bad attitudes toward his brother. God warns Cain about what this could all lead to, right? It's right there in the text. And there does seem to be an assumption that Cain has a choice to make. Indeed, as you read Genesis, it doesn't seem clear that God knows what Cain is going to do. If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if not, so God seems to be trying to talk Cain out of this murderous intent that is increasingly getting a hold of Cain's heart. Erasmus argued that God's presence there is like God's presence to everyone, that God comes, perhaps in very subtle ways, but asking questions, nudging us, calling us, moving us away from that which now comes naturally to us, which is this kind of anger and rage and envy that would lead easily to murder, or at least to very bad things and to violence. And Erasmus calls this, and it's interesting, he doesn't use the word prevenient grace, or the phrase, it was available, it was there, but maybe because of its association with predestination in the tradition, he came up with a different word. And he called it, of course, he's writing in Latin, but cooperant grace, cooperant. But Erasmus, in this argument, then is saying, look, it's not that grace is this unilateral predestining act of God. It's more like what we read with God and Cain. And God is calling Cain to a kind of cooperation. If you do well, What's wrong? Talk to me. It's God as therapist in many ways, right? Why is your face so long? What's going on with you? What's bugging you? Of course, God knows what's bugging Cain, but it's important to get Cain to speak about it, to acknowledge it, which Cain does not, right? That's the amazing thing in that Genesis text. Cain is silent in the face of these, I'll call them the wooings of God that Erasmus called cooperant grace. That's all I'll say about that debate, except to say that this definitely, Erasmus lays the groundwork for a later Dutch theologian named James Arminius. And Arminius is okay with going back to the prevenient grace language. He's just wanting to disentangle it from the predestination teaching of both Luther and then closer to Arminius's own time and culture, that of Calvin. And I'll just add one more thing in all of this. Of course, this then eventually influences Wesley, who considers himself an Arminian. So I would submit that there is a very identifiable line to be drawn from the Dutch humanist Catholic ethicist Erasmus through another Dutch theologian whose name I've never really stuck into the memory banks here, then to Arminius, and then Wesley, who even edits a journal that he calls The Arminian and identifies himself as such. And Wesley, as a Church of England guy, here's the thing. There were 39 articles of religion for the Anglicans, for John Wesley in the 18th century. When the Methodists of the New World, in the wake of the Revolutionary War, said, we want to be our own church, Wesley agreed grudgingly. He didn't really like the idea, but he didn't finally oppose it. And the Methodists said, well, articles of religion, what are going to be our articles of religion? Well, Wesley remained a Church of England guy all his life. That's important to say. But basically, Wesley took the 39 articles of the Church of England and he pared them down. He took out 14 of them to leave the 25 that still are the articles of religion for Methodist churches today. Maybe not all, but like the United Methodist Church would be the largest, most obvious one that still uses those 25 articles. Well, here's the point. Within the 39 articles of the Church of England, there was an article affirming predestination of the elect. The Church of England's trying to, find a way to move between the Reformers and Roman Catholicism, trying to find a middle way, the via media, that's the Latin, the middle way between Roman Catholicism and these upstart Protestants. So there is an article among the 39 on predestination. There's another article on prevenient grace. Again, within the tradition generally, those would have been prevenient grace housed underneath predestination. But by having them be two separate articles in the Church of England, and then Wesley removing 14 of them, he kept the one on prevenient grace. He removed the one on predestination. And I want you to see what happens when you do that. It moves predestination out from underneath the presupposition of the elect of certain people, and then God's prevenient grace working in the real time and life stuff of those elected. Now you move it into a universal category. It's no longer prevenient grace given to the elect, to the predestined, but prevenient grace offered to all, just as Erasmus argued was the case with cooperant grace. I'm really grateful for a guy like Erasmus. I preach in Lutheran churches, but I'm not terribly a big fan of Martin Luther. I don't say that from the pulpit, but but I think that as a Wesleyan, it's important to see that We believe in this grace of God as God's love and active presence laboring among all human beings and within all human beings who have ever lived and ever will live, not forcing them any more than God forced Cain, but calling, wooing, drawing. There is a cooperant note here. Clearly, the term cooperant can sound a little too much like equal parties getting together to cooperate. And that's one of the reasons why prevenient grace is a better way to go. But we believe the nature of God's grace in the Wesleyan Arminian tradition is not to overrule human capacity, but in fact to enkindle and strengthen human responsibility, such that when God asked Cain, what's bugging you, this is be right to call that prevenient grace. God doesn't force an answer and certainly doesn't force Cain to comply, but God is opening up a window of possibility that would not have been there for Cain otherwise. Amen.